Thank you, Ali, for a very nice introduction. And I can't tell you how pleased I am to be here, to be talking about the most recent book that I've written. It's not often that people ask you to talk about your work. My family's getting sick of hearing about it. So it's great to have a room full of people who I think are here on their own volition. So tonight I'm going to be talking about the dismantling of public housing in the United States. I'm going to use that phrase. I'm going to use the phrase, perhaps the death of public housing, the twilight of the afterlife of public housing. All of these things appear in my book, which perhaps is sort of an odd thing to say when we still have 600,000 to 700,000 units of public housing. And the argument that I'm making is we won't have that many for long because we continue to lose them fairly frequently. I have made for myself a Google alert, which means that I get an email every time a searchable document contains the words public housing and demolition. And I'm always getting emails and reading articles. They're usually newspaper articles. And most of them are from the U.S. Cities all across the country. Sometimes I'm halfway through the article before I realize that I'm reading about New Zealand or Australia or Canada because they're doing the same things there that we're doing here. But I will talk about the dismantling of public housing, and it's happening through the conversion of hard subsidies, unit-based subsidies, into tenant-based subsidies. It's happening through demolition. It's happening through redevelopment, through the sale, and through the conversion to other forms of assistance that we see through the programs like the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. And I think that as proof that public housing is just about history, I give you the Museum of Public Housing. This is a real place that exists. It's in Chicago. And I start my book with the observation that it's highly ironic that Chicago should be the place for a museum of public housing, because no city did more to kill public housing than Chicago, and in few places in the world was it more poorly run. So I'm going to talk about the demise of public housing with reference to four dynamics. One, I'm going to talk about it as a type of neoliberalizing of housing policy. Second, I'm going to make a little bit out of the notion that it's rationalized as occurring in the interest and being in the interests of the residents. I won't dwell too much on these 2 points, or the third one, frankly, that this is taking place in an era of central city revitalization and growth of most central cities in the United States after decades of decline, and also sort of real estate recoveries in many American cities. What I'm really going to focus on is the fourth point, and that is race. And so let's talk about what that means. In terms of neoliberalizing public housing policy, we have to remember that public housing is a quintessential New Deal program. It was created by Congress in 1937. It was actually created by the Roosevelt administration before Congress acted. It was run out of the administrative branch for a couple of years before Congress enacted the program. But it's quintessentially New Deal because it's about public works. It's about jobs in the construction industry. It was about providing then also benefits to working class, a submerged working class during the Depression. And how often nowadays do you see these words in the same sentence? Useful work under government supervision. This is not part of our lexicon these days, right? This is the idea that government can take a big issue and solve it and can work for the betterment of society is something that we don't really hear a lot about. We also don't hear about these large public works and housing programs, to be sure, as contributing to the economic development of the country as well. But it was clearly thought to be that during the 1930s, and it was sold as part of the economic recovery of during the Great Depression as well. So this is a political environment that just doesn't exist anymore. This is the political environment in which public housing was born. The idea that government can own and operate housing for lower income people, for working class people, and that they can do it well, and that it's important. It was also created in a political economy that doesn't exist anymore. Now, this is a quote about European social housing, but it actually applies to the U.S. as well, since our social housing and their social housing was created roughly the same period of time, the post-war era, the post-World War II era. And this makes reference to an expanding post-war economy, industrially based, providing new jobs, working class jobs, blue-collar jobs, and providing an expanding fiscal basis for the state to engage in expansive social programming. We don't have this political economy in place either. And what we have instead is an environment where we are looking to privatize most government activities, and this episode of the dismantling of public housing is very definitely a privatization of this particular program. But it's also beyond privatization. It's the imposition of market discipline and the disciplining of the poor by imposing work requirements on those who receive assistance, by penalizing activities and behaviors that we don't find to be acceptable. The one strike and you're out refers to our program of evicting the families of public housing residents when there is a criminal criminal act that takes place. Regardless of who in the family engages in the act, the entire family is evicted based on the one strike and you're out. And then screening criteria. One of the tricks that we play on public housing residents is we relocate them, we redevelop their housing, and then we alter the screening criteria in ways that makes their reintroduction to the units impossible because they no longer actually meet the criteria. So there's this element of neoliberal approach as well. All of this is done, as I said, in the interests of the residents. And this is so because we make reference to what in academia we call the neighborhood effects model, that this notion that the environment in which people live is very important for the economic opportunities that they can experience, for the educational opportunities that they can experience, for their life chances more generally. And given this background, public housing represents an environment that is not conducive to that kind of economic opportunity, et cetera. And so these are phrases that are used in the media that tend to dominate what I call a discourse of disaster around public housing, a discourse that has been with us for about 20, 25 years, related to what we think public housing is like in most places. Here are some more words on this discourse of disaster. And what's interesting about these quotes, not so much the hyperbole that they contain, it's who's uttering them. Right? Each and every one of these is a public official, most of whom are in charge of running public housing. One at a city level, and a couple, and the others at the national level. These are people who are supposed to be running this program. And this is how they are referring to public housing. And so the notion really is that public housing became an environment that was not conducive to the well-being of those who were living there. And so the redevelopment of public housing, the displacement of people out of those homes was for their own good. The third dynamic, as I mentioned, is that many of these public housing developments built in the late 30s, the 40s, even the 50s, may have been built in places that were not ripe for redevelopment several decades ago, but they are now. And they have been for the last 10, 15 years. Cabrini Green sits, or used to sit, on the near north side of Chicago, and for those of you who, I did graduate work in Chicago, and when Cabrini Green was there, and the notion that there was a nascent real estate market there ready to blossom at any point was almost laughable, given the stigma associated with Cabrini Green. But the week that the announcement was made that Cabrini Green was going to be redeveloped, they started building townhomes across the street. And these townhomes were selling for $250,000, $300,000, $450,000 before these were even down. It was just the announcement of the development. And the same things are true in New Orleans, in Atlanta, in Pittsburgh, in Denver. A lot of these developments were torn down because they were in the path of redevelopment. They occupied real estate that had, over the years, become valuable. And finally, as I said, race. Everything about public housing in the United States is about race. And you can't speak about public housing in the United States without speaking about race. And that's true for a number of reasons. One, public housing in the United States is disproportionately occupied by people of color. This shows the percentage of public housing units occupied by African Americans. Nationally, it's 48%. 48% of all public housing units in the United States are occupied by African Americans. African Americans make up, what, 12, 13% of the population of the United States. When you look at the larger public housing authorities, those that own and operate more than 5,000 units, it's 66%, 2/3 of the occupants of public housing. In the 305 demolitions that I study and that I'm going to report findings for, it's actually 80% of the occupants of that public housing are African Americans. So in one respect, one of the things I'm going to show you is how the demolition of public housing has had a disproportionate impact on African Americans. Well, there's a big duh there, in the sense that anything that you do to public housing will have a disproportionate impact on African Americans because they're disproportionately represented among the residents. But I'm going to go beyond this kind of simple disproportionality and provide other evidence as well. So we begin our conversation here, or our story, in the late 1980s. We're in the midst of a moral panic in the United States. Crack cocaine has hit the streets about 1986. We have this war on drugs going. We have crime that is shooting through the roof in most American cities. And so in 1989, Congress appoints a commission to look at severely distressed public housing. And I give you 4 quotes from the commission's report. The commission studied the issue for 3 years and issued its report in 1991 or 1992. And this report is mistakenly attributed by many people to be the basis for the HopeSix program and our future demolition of public housing. I say mistakenly because of these quotes up here, and I want to bring your attention to them. First, upper left, where the commission notes that what we don't want to do is focus really just on the physical conditions of public housing. We want a solution to severely distressed public housing that takes into account the social environment, that goes beyond bricks and mortar. Upper right, this effort that we have should be limited to the replacement and the rehabilitation of that portion of the housing stock that meets the criteria for severely distressed. They did a 3-year study, and they found that about 6% of the public housing in the United States met their definition of severely distressed. That's 86,000 units of public. Now, that's nothing to sneeze at. That's a lot of units, but it's still just 6% of all the public housing in the United States. And they say we should fix those. This should be our focus, and it should be limited to that. Lower left, that this program must not detract from the development of new public housing. So this should not keep us from continuing to build more public housing. After all, the need for housing is great, it's acute, it's growing, we need more public housing. So we need to fix the bad stuff that we have, but don't let this keep us from moving forward. And then finally, the last one on the lower right. HUD has some rules. HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the federal level, has some rules in place to make sure that it doesn't unnecessarily concentrate subsidized housing in a few neighborhoods. It's called their impaction rules, that you can't keep pouring the same kind of subsidized housing into the same neighborhoods. You've got to try to disperse it. But this commission said, if it comes to a choice between replacing the public housing that we're going to fix and worrying about displacing it or dispersing it, we should not worry about dispersing it. We need to replace it. So we should suspend our impaction rules so that we can rebuild the public housing on site where we demolish it. This was a commission that really valued public housing. This was a commission that wanted to save public housing. And it issued its report in 1992. The report was taken up by Congress. A program was created, and within 3 years, all 4 of these were out the window. Within 3 years, HUD was operating a program that was diametrically opposite to each of these 4. We had a program that was focused on bricks and mortar. The HopeSix program tore down public housing, it redeveloped it. We had a program that went well beyond 86,000 units. The 6% of the severely distressed. And so let's give HUD a break. Let's say that the estimate of the commission was off by a little bit. Let's say it was off by 50%. That's not a little bit, but let's say it's off by 50%. We've still done more. Let's say it was off by 100%. Let's say it's off by 200%. We're still doing more, demolishing more public housing than called for in the Commission's report. Must not detract from the development of new public housing. We don't develop new public housing anymore. There's a few units here and there. And finally, lower right, this program is all about dispersing concentrations of public housing, mixing them income-wise, et cetera. This is a program that easily and willfully and eagerly sacrificed units for dispersal, diametrically opposite of what the commission called for. All right, so the units started to come down. They came down through what is called de facto demolition. This is where a local housing authority simply quits taking care of the units and quits reletting them. And so as the units stay empty, more and more people move out. The units are then vandalized often. Other things can take place in the units. More families are traumatized by the environment that is produced, and the vacancy rate skyrockets. And suddenly you've got an empty building, and at that point it's pretty easy to get approval from HUD to tear it down. So that's de facto demolition. And so when you try to get approval from HUD, you have to go through a process that is identified in Section 18 of the original Housing Act. And so communities did that as well. There was the HopeSix program that was created in 1992. There is the Choice Neighborhoods Initiative, which has succeeded HopeSix. that was created in 2010 or 11. It's just starting its rounds. And we have now a program called the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program, which allows and facilitates the conversion of public housing to other forms of assisted housing as well. We're getting rid of public housing in all of these ways. And so the units are coming down. They're coming down in Atlanta. Techwood Homes. This, remember, was the place where we had the photo of FDR, one of the very first public housing projects in the country. In 1992, the Atlanta Housing Authority commissioned a report on the structural soundness of the Techwood Homes. And the report came in and said that Techwood Homes had served its 60-year mission and was good to go for another 60 years. It was down within 3. And it was down before the 1996 Olympics in Atlanta, and that is no coincidence. Right. Lafitte in New Orleans, a beautiful building built in 1941, classic New Deal architecture, was abandoned in Katrina, and the authorities never let the residents back in, despite the fact that there were no structural problems with the building. It survived the flood, it survived the wind, it was one of the stronger buildings in the city. It was never reoccupied, fence built around it, residents not allowed in, and demolished. I think its major problem was that it was too close to the French Quarter. This is a HopeSix development just adjacent to downtown Cincinnati. Some of these units are public housing units. Some of them are market rate. I don't know if I've got any public housing in this photo, but that's the point. I don't know where the public housing units are. The HopeSix development is supposed to make them seamlessly blend in with the rest of the development so that they are not separated, stigmatized, etc. Sometimes the new units go up in the shadows of the old high-rises. This is in St. Louis. This high-rise stuck around for about 3 or 4 years after the photo that I took because it was housing seniors. High-rises that housed families were the first ones to come down. The senior high-rises stuck around for a while longer. This high-rise is now also gone as well. These HopeSix developments are rebuilt in the new urbanist style. Everybody gets a porch. The street grid is reintroduced. The units are brought to the street, and it's meant to recreate communities of old. Some of these are public housing units mixed in with market rate developments as well. Most of these places, as I mentioned earlier, have locational advantages. This is one of the best views of Lake Superior that exists in the city of Duluth. This is your typical summer day in Duluth. But it's a gorgeous site. It's well situated relative to downtown. It's in the Central Hillside neighborhood. And I've spoken to the residents who were displaced and relocated, and they don't for a minute think that the view didn't have something to do with the fact that they no longer live there. Sometimes, however, we just tear it down under the principle that nothing is better than public housing. And so you can find sites like this in cities across the country that used to have public housing that currently have nothing, and for which there are no plans to fill as well. So what's the research been like on public housing redevelopment? Much of it has revolved around resident outcomes. Where do they go? What happens to them when they go? Well, they generally go to the next nearest affordable neighborhood, as is a classic pattern for anyone who is forcibly displaced from their housing. Most of them go to other highly segregated neighborhoods. They go to better neighborhoods, but almost every neighborhood is a better neighborhood according to the census, objective census data, if you're going to measure it by percent poverty, et cetera. The neighborhoods they do go to, however, are still predominantly poor and disadvantaged relative to neighborhoods throughout the metropolitan area. Most do not return to the redeveloped site. We also poke and prod the residents themselves and ask them serious questions about their housing satisfaction, their fear of crime, et cetera. And we ask them through surveys, we ask them through in-person interviews. I've done it, my colleagues have done it all over the country. And what do they say? Some like it, some don't. Some like some of it. And some like it some of the time. And it takes us a lot of research to find this out. So this is not the research that I'm going to report today. I've got 3 other research questions for you, all right? First, and they stem from the following. First of all, there's a great variation in the amount of demolition and the rate of demolition from one city to the next. Second, within cities, there is variation. Some projects are torn down, some are not. And so the question is, how does that happen? And then I'm going to take a brief look at neighborhood outcomes, what happens in the neighborhoods. So nationally, we've lost more than 250,000 units since 1990, but not all cities have removed public housing. On the other hand, some are going whole hog for it, right? So Atlanta has torn down all of its original public housing. Chicago is torn down, or will when it's done, more than 20,000 units. That's more units than any other city outside of New York ever built. Even though it's half of what Chicago had. Memphis is trying to tear down all of its public housing. I've got a quote in the book from the director of the Memphis Housing Authority saying, all we've got is one more and then we can wipe the words public housing from our vocabulary. And he said that proudly. Again, fox in the hen house sort of thing. But all of these other cities are extremely aggressive. Here, from the data that I had, I filed a Freedom of Information Act with HUD and got data nationally on demolitions. And my data cover a period from 1990 to 2007. And so you can see some cities really aggressive, other cities not doing this. Other cities preserving their public housing or rehabilitating their public housing or only doing spot redevelopment. But others into it, as I said, whole hog. And so the question is why? Why are some, and I have a whole set of hypotheses. The first being I wanted to test the rationale. The rationale being if public housing causes concentrated poverty, then maybe those cities that have the most concentrated poverty are tearing down the most public housing. Maybe it's got to do with crime. Maybe it's got to do with gentrification pressures. Maybe it's got to do with race. I test all of these hypotheses, and to make a long story short, because I am droning on, there are actually 2 different stories. When you take a look at the decade of the 1990s, only 2 variables explain the variation. It's crime, and it's not crime in public housing, by the way, it's just citywide crime rates. So those places that have a lot of crime, they're tearing down their public housing, whether or not that crime is taking place in the public housing. But the other factor is gentrification pressures. Those cities that were facing the greatest pressures to gentrify during the 1990s were tearing down the most public housing. The story changes a little bit in 2000. Crime is still important. Gentrification is not. Instead, what I call racially identified public housing is important. What's my variable there? My variable there is a simple ratio. It's the percentage of the public housing in the city that is occupied by African Americans. That's the numerator. The denominator is the percentage of the total population in the city that is African American. So the greater that disparity, the more racially identified the public housing is with African Americans. And sure enough, after 2000, it was in those cities with the greatest identification of public housing with African Americans that public housing was being torn down. The last one is a politics. It has something to do with progressive politics, and I can talk about that later. But where progressive policies had been pursued in other areas, they actually tore down fewer public housing products. So that explains the variation in demolition. That's a quick tour through an analysis that took me months. The second research question was, within a city, what explains which of the units came down, right? So a city's got 8, 10, 15 public housing developments. How do they make a decision about which one is the first one that comes down? And so I looked at a number of explanations, not as many this time because I didn't have as many as much data, but here's how I went about looking at the impact of race. Let's take an example of this public housing development in San Francisco. Bernal Dwellings, 208 units that were demolished in 1997. The year before it was demolished, it was 93% occupied. And of those who occupied Bernal Dwelling, 69% of them were African American. All right? In the rest of public housing that year in the city of San Francisco, only 49% of the units were occupied by African Americans. This is my disparity ratio, all right? The 69 over the 49 gives you a ratio of 1.4. This is, so what I did was I repeated that for over 300 demolitions around the country. I took, for each city, for the year that the demolition occurred, I compared it to the rest of the public housing in that city. And what I found, and by the way, you can see in all of these places, in cities across the country, you would see examples of the Bernal Dwellings kind of factor, where the units that came down had a disproportionately high percentage of African Americans compared to the rest of the public housing. This wasn't true across the board. In Los Angeles and some other cities, actually it was the other way around. It was fewer. But the number of places where I found this to be suggested that maybe this was a national pattern, and indeed it is. When you take a look at percentage black, the public housing that came down was 80%. The stuff that stayed standing, 73%. When you look at percent Hispanic, they're almost identical. Female-headed households, almost identical. Very low income, also a disparity. So the projects that came down tended to have actually poorer residents than the ones that stayed, and fewer seniors, right? We like seniors. They can occupy public housing. It's okay. The question is that 80 to 73%, is that really a meaningful disparity? I mean, if you gave testimony in a legal case about disparate impact, they usually require about a 20% difference. This isn't 20%. But I think it's about 10%, right? It's about a 10% increase. I maintain that it is significant for the following reasons, what I call the reservation effect. All right? In Washington, D.C., 99% of all public housing is occupied by African Americans. Now remember, that's my denominator, right? So if your denominator is 99 and your numerator only goes to 100, then you're not going to get much in the way of a disparate impact the way that I'm measuring it. And this is where it's all happening. This is where thousands of units are being torn down. These are cities where I can't actually even compute a disparate impact because of this reservation effect, or the fact that public housing in these cities are, in effect, reservations for low-income African Americans. So I say in that kind of environment, actually, a 10% disparate impact is significant. And I just leave it at that, and you're going to have to convince me otherwise. The last research question, and we'll go at this fairly briefly, is I took a really brief and preliminary look at what happened to the neighborhoods in those areas of public housing redevelopment. And I really just took a look at two dimensions. One, I looked at whether the degree of poverty either increased or declined in the neighborhood, right? And then I just looked at race. And frankly, at race, I just looked at percentage African American, right? So that could either increase over time or decrease. And so in the middle here, where these two axes meet, is the status quo, right? If the neighborhood didn't change after redevelopment on these two dimensions, it didn't change on race or it didn't change on poverty. That's a neighborhood that didn't change. Otherwise, you see in this area a decline in poverty, and a decline in African American population. This might be your quadrant of white gentrification, right? Up here, black gentrification, where there was no racial turnover, but there was a decline in poverty. Over here, there was desegregation, but no change in poverty, right? And so what I did was to chart then all of the demolitions that I had data for that occurred in the decade between 1990 and 2000. Oops. And this axis right here is that axis. So this is status quo right here. And so these are the projects. You can see that clearly most of the action in terms of neighborhood change is in the white gentrification, but there's a fair amount of these projects that experienced significant decline in poverty without racial change. And some actually saw even a greater African-American population. These are all, by the way, neighborhoods that were predominantly African-American to begin with. This is a preliminary analysis of neighborhood change. It has to be improved upon. We've got another decade of data, so it's a great dissertation topic for someone else. I think I'm done with this. So what did we not do over the last 20, 25 years of public housing? We didn't do a good enough job, I think, of preserving the public housing that operates well, that is not an eyesore, that is not poorly designed. We didn't do enough of rehabilitating developments that could have been saved and rehabilitated and renovated. This is a redevelopment in St. Paul, Minnesota, the largest and most diverse of Minneapolis suburbs. And you see, it looks like a very nice urban neighborhood. This is a fairly rare rehabilitation in Chicago, but again, a pretty attractive building. This is Milwaukee. This is the only development thus far that has been rehabbed in Memphis, Tennessee. And can anybody guess why? Nope, no, not seniors this time. Elvis lived there. I'm serious. Elvis lived there for a couple years. Not very long, but it was long enough to save Lauderdale Courts. There's a little plaque. This is an attractive building, right? This was public housing, and it's now a mixed income development. So in closing, my argument in the book, my argument tonight is that this is just not good housing policy. We have a continuing deficit of affordable housing in this country that is probably becoming more acute instead of less acute. The city of Chicago, as I mentioned, is tearing down 20,000 units of public housing. The last time they opened their waiting list for subsidized housing, they got 200,000 names. That's larger than the number of households in Milwaukee, in St. Louis. Right? But they're tearing it down. The city of Minneapolis, my own city, has a waiting list that at the rate at which units turn over, it will last them 66 years. In August 2010, 30,000 people showed up in suburban Atlanta to get on the waiting list for affordable housing in the heat of the summer. Some had to be hospitalized due to heat stroke, et cetera. It's not good housing policy. It's not what we should be doing because we're losing units, we're losing subsidies, we're losing housing stock that we need not lose. Second, I think this whole experience is what I call in the book an extended example of double jeopardy for the residents. We put them through decades of malign neglect. We mismanage in many cities the housing that they're in. And then when we decide to redevelop, we displace them, we move them to other high poverty and segregated neighborhoods, and we turn the neighborhood over to a new population. They're screwed twice in this. And finally, we provide, this is presented as a false choice, that we either, and I can't tell you the number of federal and local officials I've heard saying, whenever I criticize what they do, which is fairly frequently, they say, well, what do you prefer? Would you like them to be the way they were? And that's the false choice. The false choice is that they either have to be the crappy old housing that they were, neglected, disinvested in, or we have to tear it down, relocate them, displace them, and build this new stuff. Off the table altogether, apparently, is rehabilitating them in a way where people can stay on site and benefit from a revitalized community that is functional. By the way, the other thing that I should have mentioned at the beginning, which relates to this 6% and the 86,000 units, this was a commission that studied public housing in the United States for 3 years, and they came to the conclusion that 94% of it was okay. Right. That's a story that gets lost in all of this. That in most places, at most times in the United States, public housing works. And it has worked despite doing some of the toughest things that we can ask of housing. Housing the poorest in some of the worst neighborhoods and some of the most declining and disadvantaged neighborhoods in our cities. And yet it has worked. So I thank you for persevering through the talk, and we can open it up for questions. Thank you.